You have PFAS in your blood, so do I, and so does Ali Ling. And if someone knows one thing or two about PFAS, it's probably Ali Ling. She's an engineer and professor at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. She's written some of the most impactful research papers on PFAS contamination and the costs associated to it. And when 46 journalists from 29 different publications across 16 countries needed an expert to help them with their investigation on PFAS, they turned to her. Now, as Ali knows there's one thing or two about PFAS, she proactively tries to avoid them in her everyday life. Tests showed that her tap water is below detection limits for measured PFAS, she eats organic food and tries to avoid packaged meals. Yet here's the thing, when she took the test, there's PFOA, PFOS, PFHXS and PFOSA in her blood, as she shared in a LinkedIn post. What this demonstrates is that regardless of how informed you are, of how knowledgeable you are, of how cautious you are, if you live on Earth today, there's no way around getting contaminated with PFAS, a family of chemicals that we humans entirely manufactured, that reigns today even in Antarctica and may cost hundreds of dollars per year and per habitant to remove from our immediate environment.
This is the worst!
Here's why you may want to take the following 25 minutes to understand what PFAS are, what's at stake, how we can remove them from our water, and who can help with that, with my answers to the 10 most common questions people have about PFAS, starting with what exactly are PFAS and why are they called forever chemicals?
Where shall we start?
Picture a chemical structure so stable, so resistant to breaking down, that once created, it persists in our environment for centuries, maybe even millennia. That's per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and if you don't mind, I'll just call them PFAS from now on. But what makes them so incredibly durable? Well, let's zoom into the molecular structure. At their core, PFAS are built around the chain of carbon atoms. Nothing special so far. But here's the trick, every hydrogen atom that would normally attach to this carbon chain has been replaced by fluorine atoms. This carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest chemical bonds found in organic chemistry. We're talking about a bond energy of around 485 kilojoules per mole, according to the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And you can forget about this number right away. Just remember, this carbon-fluorine bond is the equivalent of industrial strength welding at atomic level.
Okay, now see that, I understand.
To put it simply, nature doesn't have the tools to break it apart, which is why we've dubbed these PFAS forever chemicals. Now, if there's an S at chemicals, it's because the PFAS family includes over 12,000 different compounds, as reported by the EPA's Comtox database as of 2023, and over 16,000 as reported by the European Union. Among those many thousands, we find some rock stars like PFOA, perfluorooctanic acid, and PFOS, perfluorooctane sulfonic acid, which you know, right?
Sure.
Oh, you don't? And if I call them Teflon and Scotchgard, how it clicks, right? Indeed, there's a reason why we have so many of these PFAS. It's because with their water-loving head and their water-repelling tail, they are incredibly attractive for countless industrial applications. This same property, however, makes them extremely mobile in the environment and excellent at accumulating in living tissues. Said differently, what makes them industrially so valuable is also what makes them such a persistent environmental nightmare today. We created something so perfect at its job that nature has no way of breaking it down, which begs the logical next question, where do we find them in our daily lives?
Let's play a game.
Let me bet, right now you're touching at least one object that's covered with PFAS. Are you sitting on your stain-resistant couch as you watch this, or brushing your teeth with dental floss, or listening to me in podcast mode while wearing your water-repellent jacket outside, or holding a fast food wrapper or coffee cup, or... Okay, you got my point, I guess. And there are clues that can put you on the track for a Spot the PFAS game, like non-stick or grease-proof or obviously waterproof. Actually, the Silent Spring Institute's research found PFAS in 72% of products marked as stain-resistant or water-resistant. One can say you know what you buy and use when you read that, right? But what that study also found is that you'll still have a 21% chance to encounter PFAS in green-labeled kids' fabric, just because it would be hard to sell to a parent if it wasn't also water or stain-resistant, and it's a father of 3 telling you this. beyond clothing, you'll have PFAS in more than half of makeup products in that nice, eco-friendly cardboard cup that doesn't pollute the environment with plastic, but is coated with PFAS because you still want it to hold your coffee, or simply in your household dust because carpets and house building materials will certainly contain it if your house is not brand new. To give them credit, PFAS were conceived to make our lives better and more convenient, and they're good at that. But that convenience comes with a price tag we're only beginning to understand. Now, how do they end up in water systems? Let's trace this forever chemicals journey into our water, shall we?
Okay, let's track them down and get to chopping.
Picture three main highways these persistent troublemakers use. First up and smallest of the three, they're literally falling from the sky. When PFAS-containing products break down, they release particles that become airborne. And a 2022 study in Environmental Science and Technology found PFAS in rainwater on all continents, even in remote Antarctica, as I told you in the introduction. The second highway, our everyday activities. Every time we wash that stain-resistant carpet or scrub that non-stick pan, we're sending PFAS down our drains. But you may think, wait a minute, we're not directly discharging our sewer to the environment, right? It goes to a wastewater treatment plant. Absolutely right, but, and we'll come back to that, these plants were definitely not designed to catch these sophisticated chemicals, and hence they slip through the cracks. Now finally, the third highway, industrial discharge. According to the Environmental Working Group's analysis of EPA data, over 4,000 industrial sites in the US are potential PFAS dischargers. Think textile mills, chemical manufacturers, paint and coating factories, or even semiconductor producers. The Northeastern University even drives this number up to 57,000 with this quite impressive map, which also accounts for wastewater treatment plants, military sites, and major airports. And that's for the US, but you can figure that this happens all around the world. At contaminated industrial sites, soil PFOS concentrations can reach up to 460,000 micrograms per kilogram, while near manufacturing facilities, PFOA concentration in the air can go all the way up to 900,000 picograms per cubic meter. If water flows through that ground or rain through that air, you can imagine it will wash it off and take those PFAS along. Somewhat also in that industrial category, we have an even heavier lifter with landfill leachate. Because yes, over the years, we've banned some PFAS, which, to be honest, we probably replaced by other PFASs, but meanwhile, those PFAS-laden products that we threw away for decades didn't vanish. They're still here, creating a toxic tea. What a weird way to call that.
That's disgusting.
That seeps into groundwater. A 2023 EPA study found PFAS concentrations in landfill leachate up to 10,000 times higher than in typical wastewater. So we have that thing called PFAS, we've seen it basically everywhere, and we have evidence that it ends up in more or less every water stream. But what health impact do PFAS have?
I'm afraid it's bad news I'm bringing you.
Disclaimer here, I'm a water engineer, not a doctor, so let's stick, pun intended, to simple facts. We've seen that PFAS is all around us, including on things we eat and drink, so it's safe to assume it enters our bodies, right? Well, the CDC's Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry found that once they enter, those chemicals can stay in our bodies for years, some taking up to 8 years just to reduce by half. And you may very logically think, come on, parts per trillion. How dangerous can that be?
What's so small?
Well, the C8 Science panel, which studied 69,000 people exposed to PFOA in their drinking water, found conclusive links to kidney cancer, testicular cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and high cholesterol. And if that's not enough, the National Institute of Health found evidence of PFAS suppressing immune system response, disrupting hormonal balance, interfering with liver function, potentially impacting fertility, and affecting children's development. One more. A 2023 study in Environmental Health Perspectives found that PFAS exposure during pregnancy could affect fetal development at concentrations far below current regulatory limits. But I'll keep my promise and leave the deeper dive in health topics to health professionals and bring it back to what I know better. Why is removing PFAS from water particularly challenging?
Don't you know how to do anything?
Well, first, because we're discussing very, very low concentrations. Let's start from the largest number, the total PFAS limit in drinking water in Europe from next year on, which is 0.5 microgram per liter, or said differently, 500 parts per trillion. For a reason I don't quite understand, people like Olympic swimming pools, so let's talk in Olympic swimming pools. 500 parts per trillion is the equivalent of 25 drops, like really drops of a substance in one Olympic swimming pool. And that's for the total PFAS limit. When you have a single threshold at 4 parts per trillion, like on PFOA and PFOS in the US, that's now 125 times less, so it's the equivalent of 1 drop of a given PFAS in 5 Olympic swimming pools. 1 drop in 5 pools. So that's the first difficulty in removing PFAS. You're dealing with a silent killer that's hard to locate and hence to catch.
I'm invisible to the naked eye.
But let's assume you nevertheless are able to spot it. The next problem is that PFAS are amphiphilic molecules. I checked, that word exists. Trust me, it simply means that they are both hydrophobic and hydrophilic. Just this dual nature in itself already makes them incredibly difficult to target with a single treatment approach, as they're just slipping out like soap on both ends. But to add to the complexity, different PFAS compounds also have varying chain length, which is the number of carbon atoms in the molecule's backbone structure. The ultra-short ones will have 2 to 3 carbon atoms, the short ones 4 to 6, and the long ones 7 or more. So let me use a fishing analogy here. You need different bait to catch different fish. Just to take the 2 most popular PFAS removal processes, activated carbon and ion exchange, well, activated carbon works well for long chain, but struggles with some short chain ones, and ion exchange is the other way around, good for short chain, sometimes falling short for long chain. But even assuming you've located those drops of PFAS in several Olympic swimming pools, and you've been able to catch them despite their amphiphilic nature and their varying chain length. Once you have them, what do you do with them? Well, as we'll see in a minute, you will have to dispose of them or to destroy them, and that's not straightforward either. Plus, all of that is expensive, and to come back to Ali Ling's body of work, right now, there is not enough money on Earth to remove PFAS from the environment at the same rate as we're adding it. So, for long, we've looked at those challenges and thought, oh, it's a good thing I don't have to do anything about any of that. But things changed as regulation caught up with the PFAS threat, so let's look at that next. What are the current regulatory limits and how are they evolving?
There's a new sheriff in town, and he's going to clean up this mess.
So let me tell you a short story. I was in New York 3 years ago when the US EPA released their health advisory on PFAS in drinking water. That was already an event in itself. The fact that a major regulator addressed the PFAS challenge placed it on the map, but while it got us talking at that water conference in New York, many still brushed it off. After all, it had taken the Cuyahoga River to burn 13 times for the US to adopt the Clean Water Act. So many predicted it would still take a long while from that health advisory to a regulation. But not this time, and that's how, in April 2024, the EPA came up with the limits I already teased in the previous question: 4 parts per trillion or PPT for PFOA and PFOS, 10 parts per trillion for PFH excess, PFNA and HFPODA, more commonly known as GenX. That's for the US, and it's only beginning there as Ali Ling's state, coincidence or not, Minnesota, now proposes to also regulate PFAS in biosolids, which is the nice name we give to wastewater sludge. Meanwhile, Europe is taking a different path. The EU has set a collective limit of 100 ppt for 20 different PFAS compounds and 500 ppt for all PFAS combined, becoming binding in 2026, so next year, time flies. However, as for some states in the US, some European countries are racing ahead, with Denmark leading the pack with a 2 parts per trillion limit on the sum of PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, and PFH excess, which is somewhat 14 times more stringent than the already quite stringent US. Sweden follows closely at 4 ppt, and Germany is swimming in similar water than the US, as they're aiming for 20 ppt by 2028. Meanwhile, the UK obviously took again a different approach by aiming at a 100 parts per trillion limit, but this time across 47 PFAS compounds instead of the only 20 compounds in continental Europe. Now, things are still evolving as Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden proposed a broader restriction that would extend to shorter chain PFAS.
Thought I was pretty clear.
Okay, that's for the drinking water regulations, but there's more, with industrial regulation that's writing its own chapter in this story.
Okay. Never mind.
Here, Belgium is at the tip of the spear with a 20 parts per trillion limit for industrial discharges, while the US EPA is launching new investigations into 4 key industrial sectors in 2025, including battery manufacturing and oil and gas industries. That may sound light so far for industries, but it may rapidly evolve under maybe some lawsuits, but also the simple law of the market, as there is a big cost component to the equation, as we'll cover now in answering to this one: what's the estimated cost impact for water utilities?
Okay, so let's talk money.
This is controversial in the US and contested with yet another lawsuit, but when the EPA came up with this PFAS regulation, it estimated it would cost $1.5 billion a year on average, to implement new removal steps in 4,100 to 6,700 public water systems across the country. That, roughly speaking, $9 billion cost over 6 years, as the regulation will be enforced by 2029, is challenged in front of court by the American Water Works Association that estimates that it would cost an initial investment of $37 to $48 billion to upgrade more than 7,000 water systems, while the ongoing operation would then cost twice as much as the EPA's calculation. Whereas the truth in that, the future, and maybe the court will tell, but Global Water Intelligence's own assessment leads to $13 billion of investment towards the end of the decade, to which you'll have to add the operation and maintenance costs, which more or less leads to nicely in the middle of the AWWA and EPA positions.
Makes me feel like I'm in the middle of a bidding war.
In Europe, the picture is again different, with the Drinking Water Directive entering into force in 2026 and estimating an extra treatment cost for drinking water of 0.23 euro per cubic meter. If we project that today half of tap water samples exceed the upcoming limit, that could result in about $4.5 billion a year. But that's without the discussed reinforced regulations, which could drive the cost anywhere from 95 to 2,000 billion euros over the next 20 years, or if we annualize it, from 4.75 billion euros to 100 billion euros a year. Brought back to a cost per household, PFAS treatment could lead to an additional 480 euros annual water bill, and that's a lot. But if we compound in that the annual health-related cost of PFAS exposure in Europe are estimated to be between 52 and 84 billion euros, you'd probably rather pay for your increased water bill than for your cholesterol treatment at best, cancer treatment at worst, right?
Exactly what are you a doctor of?
But stop me here because I'm venturing into health again, which I want to avoid, so let's move to water processes. What are the main technologies to remove PFAS from drinking water? How are you? Good? I'm speaking lots of words, ultra fast. I thought you may appreciate a break. Am I right? Hey, I appreciate if you stay on the ride with me, but in case you have to jump out, I've placed chapters in this one so you can hop back in wherever you left it. So just a sip and we're back at it with the technologies to remove PFAS.
Well, we're waiting.
Let's go. At scale, there are 2+1 technologies that are proven and ready to remove PFAS. I say 2+1 because the EPA only lists 2 of them, activated carbon and ion exchange, while everybody agrees that reverse osmosis can do the job equally well, it just might be significantly more expensive.
I like money.
So let's look at activated carbon first, as somewhat the veteran champion in this fight. To take a rough metaphor, activated carbon works like billions of microscopic hooks packed together, creating an intricate maze where PFAS molecules get trapped. As long as there are free hooks available, you keep your system running, and once all the hooks have caught their fish, you replace your exhausted activated carbon with fresh one and start again. Some, if not most, of the activated carbons can be reactivated once exhausted, so you don't have to dump them right away. You can send them back to a furnace where they will stay several hours at temperatures over 950,000 degrees, which will also destroy the PFAS they caught. Nice welcome side effect. And you can then bring them back to a second useful life. The technology is particularly effective with longer chain PFAS like PFOA and PFOS, and can actually be 100% effective when properly configured. But I already mentioned the catch some minutes ago. Shorter chain PFAS don't stick as well to the carbon, which requires you to whether replace it more frequently, which can be expensive, or accept that your removal performance may drop. The second major player, ion exchange, leverages special resins that are designed with a mix of fixed ions permanently attached to the structure and mobile counter ions that can be exchanged. When water containing PFAS flows by the resin, it stops to have a chat with the fixed ions, and they trade their PFAS and their counter ions. I know, I make it sound like they're exchanging Pokemon cards, but basically, that's how it works. As long as the fixed ions have counter ions to trade, the process keeps working, and once they've exchanged all they had to exchange, the resin is deemed saturated. That's when you stop flowing water by it and instead backflush your resin with a brine solution, typically sodium chloride, that collects all the received PFAS and exchanges them again for fresh counter ions, and that's where you can start a new cycle. Ion exchange offers high removal capacity and smaller footprints compared to activated carbon, but typically it's slightly more expensive, and the spent materials, you know, the brine solution you flow by it to collect the PFAS, needs special handling. The third in our arsenal is reverse osmosis, which is actually very simple to understand. You take a membrane with very, very small pores, so small that even water doesn't naturally flow through it, and push your stream so strongly through it with pumps that ultimately water makes it through it, but only water and nothing else, certainly not PFAS. Now, if it is extraordinarily effective as it removes removes all types of PFAS regardless of chain length. It is also energy intensive, hence again more expensive, and creates here as well a concentrated waste stream that needs careful management. To be clear, under today's regulations both in Europe and the US, you're good to go with activated carbon or ion exchange, and you don't need to go to the extra cost of reverse osmosis. But if regulations were to tighten again one day, for instance by including short-chain PFAS, reverse osmosis may impose itself as the best option despite the extra cost. Now, if those are the mainstream ones, there are also more technologies being developed with exciting newcomers, starting with foam fractionation, which is particularly clever. The way it works is you send very small bubbles of air at the bottom of a water column, and as the bubbles rise to the surface, they leverage PFAS's natural tendency to create foam so that they hop on the ride with the bubbles and concentrate on the surface. Then you separate out the foam, and as for most of our removal processes, you have clean water on one end and a PFAS waste to handle on the other hand. On the plus side, foam fractionation is cost-effective and cheaper than activated carbon. On the minus side, it may struggle even more with short-chain PFAS. Then we still have more contenders with selective adsorbents using similar principles than activated carbon, but with specially designed materials that target specific PFAS molecules. And then further on the horizon, we're seeing some intriguing experimental approaches with biological treatment methods and flotation techniques. Last one, and it's an incredible idea, like a mind-blowing one that comes back every single time a new regulation comes around, like I mean, it gives me flashbacks from the micropollutant removal times. We see more and more people advocating for combining those technologies, like Of course it works, and of course it's more effective than the single ones individually.
Well then, what's the problem?
But the reason I'm making a bit of fun of it is that, guess what? It's more expensive. 2 processes instead of 1. Even if you downsize your process, it's always more expensive. And I fear nobody will pay for that. In summary, all those technologies are removal technologies. And removal is what regulations command today. You want your PFAS out of your water? Those technologies do that, and they do it great. But they're not destruction technologies, meaning you still have your PFAS, just now in a concentrated stream or sticking onto a medium. So I guess you need to do something about it. Contribute to the problem by just throwing it away. Sorry. Disposing it, or get to PFAS destruction. But how do you destroy PFAS?
Violence is the only trade I know.
Let's go back to the beginning. Catching PFAS and taking it out of water is not easy, but it's not that complex. I mean, we know how to desalinate water and remove almost any kind of pollutant. PFAS is, at the end of the day, just one of those. But destroying it is a different story. Remember how I qualified the carbon-fluorine bond as the equivalent of industrial welding? Well, I mean it. To break it, we need some seriously impressive technology, but it's the water industry. Don't worry, we have that on shelf. Or almost, because the technology's development is being finalized. So let me walk you through our molecular demolition toolkit, starting with the highest technology readiness level with electrochemical oxidation. Electrochemical, it's in the name. 2 reactions are at play here. The electric current triggers an electron transfer on the PFAS molecule that breaks the carbon-fluor bond, or like a shrimp, it cuts the head. Meanwhile, that same current also generates oxidizing radicals, for instance, hydroxyl radicals, that will mineralize down the rest of the PFAS body down to nice little piles of atoms. It works, it requires a good knowledge of reactor and anode design, it may be expensive to operate, and if you don't know what you're doing, it can trigger the generation of toxic byproducts. But if you want to hear from a company that sure knows what it's doing, check my interview with Julie Bliss-Mullen from Aclarity. A variation of that is to replace the electric current with a catalyst using a different source of energy to activate it, the principle being otherwise the same. You cut the head of the shrimp and you mineralize it down. Go check my interview with Fajr Mushtaq if you want more details of how Oxyle does that. Now, in the next bracket of technology readiness, we have supercritical water oxidation. The idea this time is to push water beyond its critical point, so beyond 374 degrees and above 221 bars of pressure, which causes its properties somewhat to flip, meaning it's no longer the universal solvent and you can use simple air to oxidize and mineralize all components inside. Companies like 374 Water, which you bet was my guest as well, are achieving 99.999% destruction rates, plus the reaction is exothermic, so there are also energy merits to it. Now, on the flip side, systems tend to scale and clog, and it works much better with highly polluted streams, which makes it probably more of a landfill leachate treatment than a drinking water one. But it's promising. Beyond those two, we have circular recovery of PFAS through technologies like Pure Affinity's one, where you're adsorbing PFAS as you would with activated carbon, but then you also make it circular and use it again. So you keep the ability to use PFAS thanks for their technical services while preventing them to slip out of your closed loop. Not a destruction technology per se, but swimming in similar venture waters. Then you have technologies such as plasma, electroporation, photocatalysis, or sonolysis that use similar mechanism to the shrimp head cutting, and pyrolysis or gasification that follows more of the thermal route and would be closer to the means at work in supercritical water oxidation. All of those are being developed but are slightly more prospective. Finally, there's one more thing you can do to get rid of your medium that's loaded with PFAS, which you can even do with water, to be honest. It's to burn it, and I'm listing it last because that's the obvious way used most of the time today, even though not always properly, which means it occurs far too often that incineration done wrong results in PFAS rejection to the atmosphere, which just keeps everything in the same loop. Indeed, to break the carbon fluoride bond and hence get everything else to fall apart, you need to not just burn it, but to do it over 930 degrees at least, and most of the time at 1050 to 1100 degrees C to be absolutely safe. It's sure energy hungry, requires special incinerators, and as I said, if you don't maintain that temperature perfectly, you'll create even more problematic compounds. So, now that we know what PFAS are, why they're problematic and challenging, where they are found and how we can remove them and even destroy them, what's happening now? Well, let's distinguish by regions, starting this time with Europe. In Europe, the PFAS regulations we discussed earlier are part of the revamped EU Drinking Water Directive that was adopted in 2020. But a European regulation in itself doesn't have much power.
Because that would be too easy.
It needs to be transposed in each country's law, which has always got a bit delayed, but to be honest, not as much as usual, so that by today, 26 member states have transposed the regulation and the 27th should do it by February 2025. The European Commission published the final technical guidelines last August, and as of January 2026, compliance with the mandatory PFAS limit values will be enforced. This starts with monitoring PFAS levels and, whenever they are over the top, implementing one of the removal technologies. I can give you my first-hand feedback on that, as when I was still living in France last year, I received a letter at home saying my local water utility had found PFAS over the limit in my drinking water and that they were deploying measures to mitigate it. They did not specify the removal process they would use, but statistically so far, it's been 2/3 activated carbon, 1/3 ion exchange in the rollout in Europe, with some spectacular exceptions aiming at reverse osmosis and some more smaller systems going for foam fractionation. In the US, the regulation initially was to be enforced by 2027, but that was pushed back to 2029 for the treatments, while the 2027 deadline remains for monitoring. So, in concrete steps, large systems in the US will have to measure PFAS every quarter, and smaller systems twice a year for the 6 nationally regulated PFAS compounds and inform the public about the actual levels. In parallel to that, public water systems will also have to monitor and report the presence of 30 chemical contaminants, 29 types of PFAS, and lithium, which may give a hint about a future evolution of the regulation. For the deployment of PFAS removal steps, small water utilities can tap into a $9 billion pocket made available by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to whether invest in actual treatment steps or invest in lawyers and file lawsuits against PFAS producers and industrial users that would be in their watershed. As a European, let me say, that's so American. Overall, and regardless of their size, water utilities can leverage state revolving funds to help finance their removal efforts, which also gives us a glimpse into who's deploying what, with the US's East Coast mostly investing in activated carbon, and the West Coast rather going for ion exchange. Up in the north, in Canada, where I'm sitting right now, PFAS regulations are still an objective and not a mandatory value. By the end of this month, companies need to monitor and report on 312 PFAS, and the removal target is expected for later in this decade. Europe and North America together represent about 80% of the expected PFAS removal activity for the second half of this decade. The next activity spot being Australia, where Sydney found a couple of PFAS in its drinking water and implemented foam fractionation to remedy it, and China tackling PFAS under its new Pollution Control Action Plan since 2022. You may wonder, where is the usual good pupil, Singapore, in that list? Well, Singapore already extensively applies reverse osmosis to its drinking water, so they're already more or less PFAS free. A good pupil. I told you. Now, that's not the only perk in Singapore's world-leading approach to water, which you'll find out if you click right here. And in the meantime, if there's any PFAS-related question I've missed, let's discuss it in the comments. Make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.